It was called the Battle of Morecambe. On the 29th of September 1952, the Labour Party gathered here in the Morecambe Winter Gardens for its annual party conference. It was the first of the new Queen's reign, although I don't think they sang the national anthem. The Morecambe Conference would be one of the most dramatic and important in the history of the Labour Party. One historian wrote, men and women who had been there spoke of it 20 years later with bated breath. Another historian wrote, few people who endured that supremely unenjoyable week ever forgot that atmosphere of hostility, amounting even to hatred. The future Labour leader, Michael Foot, said that the conference was rowdy, convulsive, splenetic, vulgar, threatening at moments to collapse into an irretrievable brawl. It is said that the Morecambe Conference outranked even the Labour Party conferences of the 1980s in terms of its bitterness. To provide some context, it was the first party conference that Labour had had out of government in over a decade. The previous year, the Labour Party, led by Clement Attlee, had unexpectedly lost to Winston Churchill's Conservatives. And at issue for the conferences at the delegates at the conference was whether the Labour Party should take a leftward direction following its defeat. Aneurin Bevan, the former health secretary, had dramatically resigned from the Attlee government the previous year over the introduction of charges for some NHS services such as dentistry and eyeglasses. He and his allies, collectively known as the Bevanites, believed that Labour had lost power because it had compromised too much on its socialist values. On the other side of the party was the trade union right. Most union leaders and a majority of Labour MPs believed that the party needed to be more pragmatic in its electoral offer and more supportive of the United States. They dismissed the left-wingers who wanted pure socialism as deluded fantasists. They rejected plans to nationalize even more industries or the Bevanites' proposals to use strikes as political weapons to bring down the Conservative government. The conference was opened by the Mayor of Morecambe and by the Chair of the Morecambe Constituency Labour Party. Nearly 2,000 party and trade union delegates squashed into this hall with hordes of journalists, ordinary party members, and curious onlookers trying to get a seat or even a place to stand. So packed and chaotic was this Winter Gardens that it was likened to a rugby scrum. One of the delegates at the conference was my grandfather, Jack Johnson, a school teacher in Leicester, who made a speech on this stage calling for the abolition of grammar schools, controversial Lancaster here. It gives me very great pleasure to stand on the very same stage as my grandfather 70 years later to the weekend and to acknowledge his memory and to pay tribute to the inspiration his life has always given me. Things started optimistically. The mayor spoke proudly of Morecambe's place, quote, on the shore of Britain's bonniest bay. The chairman of Morecambe Labour Party joked that holding conference in Morecambe would be a great asset to us, far better than the propaganda which we get from central office. Soon, however, things turned sour. To set the scene, and some in the audience may be familiar with this, the weather was appalling. It pelted it down with rain the whole 5 days. One journalist said the weather in Morecambe is vile, squally rain and high winds. As a result, Morecambe was not particularly highly rated as a venue for those who attended the conference. Bernard Donahue, who would go on to be an advisor for Harold Wilson, said, quote, Morecambe was not an ideal location. Accommodation was dispersed and not always very good. The Labour MP Dick Crossman more generously recalled, there was a superb view across the mud to the mountains of the Lake District. But then Crossman added, and there's always a but at this conference, there is nothing to be said whatsoever for Morecambe except for this view, which appeared at 30-hour intervals for a minute or two throughout the week in between the rain. Even Clement Attlee wasn't terribly impressed with the venue. He wrote to his brother when he returned back to London, I've just got back to Morecambe. Architecturally, it ranks a good second to Blackpool. The latter beats it in the atrocious ugliness of its buildings, but Morecambe pulls up in the complete absence of city planning. Crossman would have agreed with Attlee. He wrote, "It's a minor Blackpool, dumped down on mud flats with a 4-mile-long promenade with the Grosvenor at one end, the Winter Gardens in the middle, and the other big hotel, the Midland, at the other end." So one historian summed up that Morecambe was, quote, "an undistinguished seaside resort, never patronized by Labour before or since." Indeed, the 1952 Labour conference was the only party conference of the major parties to have been held in Morecambe. Unfortunately, I'm sad to say the Winter Gardens itself came into some criticism. It was said to be too small, the lighting was said not to be great, and perhaps exacerbated by these surroundings, tensions at the conference ran high. Early in the conference, Arthur Deacon, the General Secretary of the Transport and General Workers Union, which is now Unite, was invited to give fraternal greetings from the Trades Union Congress. Now, normally, the fraternal address would be quite anodyne, quite a nice thing. But there was no brotherly love coming from Brother Arthur. He offered what one journalist called an uncompromising declaration of war on the Bevan Group. His speech was repeatedly interrupted by angry delegates. As one newspaper put it, there was considerable booing, catcalling, and some cheers while Mr. Deacon was speaking. Hecklers told him to get out and even started singing the song, "Tell Me the Old Story." The chair of the conference had to plead for calm, but delegates shouted invective, and to his credit, I suppose, Deacon shouted right back. He told the hecklers that they insulted the trade union movement. He said, "The very essence of being fraternal is to tell you the truth, and if you don't like it, it's too bad." Aneurin Bevan, who was the target of his invective, shrugged it off. He said, "In public life, for every kiss you get 2 slaps." The conflict presaged the most dramatic moment of the conference, which was the vote for the constituency representatives on the National Executive Committee. And this may sound a slightly technical election, but the NEC was a very powerful body in the Labour Party, especially outside of opposition, because it is still in some ways today. In a dramatic turn of events, all of the right-wing Labour NEC members, except for one, lost their seats. This included the Deputy Leader, Herbert Morrison, who'd been on the NEC for 30 years, and the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Hugh Dalton, who'd been on the NEC for 27 years. Nye Bevan and his allies, Harold Wilson, Barbara Castle, Tom Dryburgh, Ian Mikado, and Dick Crossman were all victorious. The Bevanites had won, and they toasted their victory across the road at the Midland Hotel. Herbert Morrison and Hugh Dalton reacted differently to their dramatic defeats. Morrison took the defeat on the chin. He had expected it. He'd spent the morning going up and down the promenade in the pouring rain, almost sort of bracing himself for the defeat. When the defeat came, Morrison was sat up on this stage and he was sucking an unlit pipe and doodling on his conference papers. He showed no emotion. But then he came up to give the address from the outward leaving NEC, and he delivered the speech of his life. One journalist said that Morrison took the conference by the scruff of the neck and rubbed their noses in the facts. Another journalist said that Morrison made many in the packed hall feel a little bit ashamed for what they had just done to him. And when he finished his speech, the conference hall erupted in thunderous applause for several minutes. Hugh Dalton, on the other hand, a slightly more sensitive character, took things more to heart. Already a bit emotionally fragile, he retreated to his hotel room, streaming in tears. He was discovered by his agent clutching a bottle of whiskey. Harold Wilson, who Dalton had once called Nye's little dog, got his revenge when he started going around the conference saying gleefully, "Well, Nye's little dog has bitten Dalton where it hurts." Hugh Gaitskell, the shadow chancellor and an acolyte of Dalton, was outraged. He called the NEC elections, quote, "not only an act of gross political ingratitude, but a piece of blind stupidity." His ally, Bessie Braddock, the formidable Liverpool MP, stood on the stage and denounced Bevan directly. She accused him of bad faith and bad language. Boos and shouts rang out. Go home, one of the delegates told Mrs. Braddock. She told the delegate that he was probably a communist and he needed to go home. George Brown, a young MP on the right of the party who would one day become deputy Labour leader, summed it all up. He said, "It seems to me this conference is rapidly going mad." The trade union leadership was apoplectic. One trade union official started screaming, "After this, there'll be no more bloody money for this bloody party." So enraged was he that he inadvertently spat out his false teeth. One of the delegates picked up the teeth and handed the dentures back. "I believe these are yours." The union boss just slapped them back in his mouth without a word of thanks and then continued to denounce the irresponsibility of the Labour Party. The leader of the National Union of Mine Workers, Will Lather, called the left-wing delegates mad hares. When interrupted by a delegate, Lather spat back, "Oh, shut your gob." Arthur Deakin waved his fist at the Bevanites and told them to abandon their vituperation and carping criticism. Tom Williamson, the General Secretary of the General and Municipal, now the GMB, described the Bevanite resolutions, which included scaling down the British military and spending more on public services, as sheer nonsense and humbug. The union leaders began to plot. How could they change the party rules to cut out the influence of the ordinary members? There were even talks of deposing Clement Attlee as leader and installing Herbert Morrison instead. Attlee, for his part, had kept his distance. A characteristically quiet man, he said nothing. He did not offer a word of sympathy to either in public or private to any of the right-wing candidates who lost the NEC seats. He refused to take sides. But when the MPs returned to London after conference, he gave them a dressing down. He said, "Drop it. Stop this sectionalism. Work with the team. Turn your guns on the enemy, not your friends." But the bad weather continued at the conference, and delegates began to fall ill. Herbert Morrison started to feel a bit woozy during the conference ball, which had been held next door. He woke up the next morning with a terrible cold and confined to his bed for the rest of the conference. His biographer wrote that, quote, "Morecambe was a miserable experience in every way." One observer said that the acrimony carried on into the streets. Rival factions were glaring at each other across the promenade. Certain cafes and pubs became known as the Bevanite pub or the Deaconite pub. Not everyone at the conference, it should be said, was a hardcore Bevanite or Deaconite. One delegate from Yeovil complained, "We have witnessed a display of bad manners from both wings. It worries many of us who are just trying to make up our minds." After 5 days of vigorous discussion, the mayor of Morecambe brought things to a close. He said how very proud he was of the way that our citizens have taken you into their hearts. He obviously hadn't read any of the letters people were sending back. As for the dreadful weather, the mayor of Morecambe made no apologies. He said, "Weather is not controlled by local government. It's controlled by the Air Ministry. And of course, you know what government is in power now." In spite of the mayor's levity, the conference delegates left Morecambe feeling battered and bruised by both rain and internal party strife. Douglas Jay, a former minister, said that the Morecambe conference was, quote, "one of the most unpleasant experiences I have ever suffered in the Labour Party." Dick Crossman recorded, quote, "By the end of the conference, everyone had streaming colds as well as farting." There seemed to almost be a curse of the Morecambe conference. Ian McKay, a respected journalist of industrial relations, gave one of the final speeches of the conference, and he was treated to cheers and laughter, almost as an attempt to heal the wounds. Minutes later, McKay walked out of the hall onto the promenade, clutched his chest, collapsed, and died of a heart attack. Soon after, the Labour MP Roy Jenkins was driving in his car back to London when he got into a car accident and received injuries to his face. Now, let me say that I hope you all have a more enjoyable time in the Winter Gardens here tonight. And I hope that you also have a safer journey home. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much. Now, if it's possible,